those of you that are PJs or have been with the program for a little while know that we've recently gone through this shift from the OMB circulars. We had A87, we had A122, we had A133. All of that stuff has been subsumed and overtaken by what they're calling the Omni Circular, where OMB got together and kind of rewrote all of that and pulled it into the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, right? And that's now all placed at 2 CFR 200. So it's Chapter 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. At the end of the day, the PJ is responsible for making sure that all costs charged to the program are eligible, they're allocable, right, that we can actually trace them to expenses for the program, that they're necessary, reasonable, and documented. You as a CHDO are not per se subject to federal procurement rules. You are not fundamentally required from a federal standpoint to go out and do sealed bid procurement, for example. Your PJ may require you to do that, and there are good reasons that your PJ may require you to do that. So you need to anticipate that the PJ wants to see that you have a reasonable cost, because they have an obligation to make sure your costs are reasonable. So sometimes they're going to require you to do some level of procurement because the results of a procurement process are presumed to be reasonable. Right? If we have a competitive bidding situation, the most responsive bid is presumed to be reasonable. So it's one way of documenting reasonableness. But it also means that you as a CHDO have some flexibility in sometimes, for example, identifying your general contractor on the front end and working with them to figure out what you're going to build. Because having that contractor's involvement can actually help you do a better project in many cases. Because they can tell you, hey, this thing that you think you want, do you know how expensive it is to build it that way? If we did this, we can reach the same outcome you want at a much more reasonable cost. So the PJ is going to evaluate your project to make sure that the costs are overall reasonable and that the costs they're paying for are eligible. But fundamentally what we're trying to do is make sure that we're getting an effective use of the federal funds. Doesn't mean we have to get the cheapest, but it needs to be a reasonable cost. And that's a perspective that the PJ has to apply, and how they apply that may change your experience on the ground in terms of them saying, well, how did you select your contractor? How did you select your architect? If you're just working with people that you're familiar with, which may be an entirely appropriate way to do development in some cases, having a development team that has worked together, that knows what they're doing, that knows what's needed, can actually produce a more cost-effective project in many cases. But in those types of cases where you don't have competitive procurement, the PJ may be looking more closely at your project cost to make sure that things are reasonable.